Read this letter, sir. The words were spoken so quietly that Harold Whitmore almost did not hear them above the soft mechanical hum of the orchid greenhouse, where he had been standing alone for the better part of 20 minutes, doing what he always did on Thursday evenings in late September, which was nothing in particular. He was holding a small pair of silver pruning shears in his left hand and a cut stem of dendrobium in his right, and he had been thinking, in the loose, unhurried way an old man thinks when no one is watching him, about his late brother Theodore, who had died 41 years ago in a hotel room in Caracas, and whose memory still arrived on certain evenings without warning. He turned slowly. The boy was standing on the far side of the long teak workbench, half hidden by a column of climbing jasmine, one small hand held out in front of him with a folded envelope balanced on his open palm. He was perhaps 9 years old, maybe 10. In a clean denim jacket that had been buttoned all the way to the throat against a chill, the boy had walked through to reach this particular greenhouse on this particular evening, and his shoes had been wiped carefully on the small mat outside the side door, which Harold knew, because the mat was visible from where he stood, and the mud he had tracked across it earlier had been recently disturbed by smaller feet. Harold did not recognize the boy immediately. The estate covered 1,100 acres, and the staff who tended the grounds, the stables, the kennels, the orchards, and the small private chapel that his grandmother had built in 1923 numbered just over 60 people on any given week. He could not be expected, even by the most demanding standards of an old-school household, to know every face that moved through the lower paths of the property. But he had been raised by a mother who believed that a man who could not name the people in his own gardens had no business calling them his own, and so he made it his business, in the long quiet years since her death, to learn the names of as many of them as he could. He recognized the boy after a moment. His name was Caleb. His mother, Yolanda Briggs, had worked in the laundry of the main house for nearly 7 years, and she had begun bringing the boy with her after school sometime in the late spring, when whatever arrangement had previously kept him with an aunt in Wilmington had quietly come undone. Harold had passed the boy 3 times in the back corridor near the linen pantry. He had not yet found the right moment to learn his name properly. He learned it now, the way a man learns most important things, by being given no choice in the matter. "What did you say, son?" Harold asked. His voice was the voice he used in the orchid house, which was softer than the voice he used anywhere else on the property, because the orchids, his wife Alina had once insisted, did not respond well to the tone he used in boardrooms. The boy did not lower his hand. The envelope, Harold could see now, was a small cream-colored thing of the kind sold in dime stores, sealed with a strip of ordinary household tape along the upper flap, and the boy's hand was trembling very slightly, not from fear, Harold thought, but from the considerable effort it took for a 9-year-old to stand in an orchid greenhouse on a Thursday evening and hand a folded letter to a man whose name was carved above the front gates of the road he had walked up to deliver it. "Read this letter, sir," the boy said again, more clearly this time. "I think you need to read it before tomorrow morning, before the meeting. Please." Harold Whitmore was 76 years old. He had presided over Whitmore Continental Energy for 48 years. He had been handed many letters in many quiet rooms by many people who believed their letters were important. He had learned over the course of those decades that almost none of them were. But he had also learned, by paying close attention to the shape of a hand and the weight of a silence, the small unmistakable difference between a letter that was unimportant and a letter that was simply being delivered by someone too small to be listened to. He set the pruning shears down on the teak bench. He set the dendrobium stem down beside the shears. He reached across the workbench and took the envelope from the boy's hand. The envelope was lighter than he expected. Harold turned it once in his fingers, the way he turned any document handed to him in any circumstance, examining first the seal and second the weight, and third the small particular smell that paper picked up from the place where it had been kept. This envelope smelled faintly of laundry soap and a child's pocket, which told Harold that the letter inside had been carried close to the boy's body for some hours before it had arrived in the greenhouse, and that wherever the boy had been keeping it, he had been keeping it carefully. There was no name on the front of the envelope. There was no name on the back. The tape along the upper flap had been pressed down with the small, unsteady pressure of a child's thumb, and there was a faint half-circle of fingerprint visible in the adhesive where someone, the boy presumably, had checked at least once that the seal was holding. "Caleb," Harold said quietly, and he watched the boy's eyes widen slightly at the sound of his own name, the way the eyes of a child widen when an adult he has only seen from a distance turns out to know more about him than he had expected. "Where did this letter come from?" The boy hesitated. He glanced once toward the side door of the greenhouse, the small reflexive glance of a child measuring the distance between himself and the path that led back toward the laundry building, where his mother had almost certainly told him to stay this evening, and where she almost certainly did not know he had gone. Then he seemed to decide something inside himself, the way Harold had seen grown men decide things in the small private moment before they signed contracts they could not undo, and he met Harold's eyes. "I can't tell you where I found it, sir. Not yet. I have to make sure you read it first, because if I tell you where I found it before you read it, you might not read it, and then it won't matter where I found it." Harold looked at the boy for a long moment. He was, despite himself, somewhat impressed. The logic was the logic of a child, but it was the logic of a child who had been thinking about the problem for some considerable time before he had walked up the long gravel path to the greenhouse, and who had arrived at the only sequence of events that made sense from inside his particular set of constraints. Harold had built a great deal of his career on recognizing that kind of thinking in people, and he had learned not to dismiss it simply because the person doing the thinking happened to be 9 years old. "All right, Caleb," he said, "I will read the letter, but I would like you to stay in this greenhouse while I read it. Will you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Sit down on that stool by the door. Don't go anywhere. If your mother comes looking for you, I will speak to her myself. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." The boy walked across the slate floor to the small wooden stool beside the side door and sat down on it carefully, his hands folded in his lap. He did not slouch. He did not swing his feet. He sat with the small, upright stillness of a child who had been taught that the way a person held himself in an unfamiliar room said something true about the way that person had been raised. And he had been raised, Harold could see now, by someone who took the matter seriously. Harold turned back to the workbench. He pulled a small pair of reading glasses from the breast pocket of his cardigan, the cardigan Alina had given him for his 65th birthday, and which he still wore on Thursday evenings because Alina had liked the color, and he settled the glasses carefully on the bridge of his nose. He picked up the silver pruning shears from the bench and used the tip of one blade to slit the tape along the upper flap of the envelope. He set the shears back down. He drew out a single folded sheet of plain white paper. He unfolded it. The handwriting was not a child's. It was the handwriting of an adult, and it was the handwriting of an adult who had been trained at some point in her life to write the way certain women of a certain generation had been trained to write, with the small precise loops on the lower-case G's and the careful crossbars on the T's that came from convent schools and Catholic primary academies of a certain decade. Harold recognized the style immediately because his own mother had written that way, and his mother-in-law had written that way, and Alina herself, when she had been alive and writing letters at the small rosewood desk in the morning room, had written that way also. The letter was not long. It was perhaps 14 lines. Harold read it once quickly, the way he read any document the first time, to gather the shape of the thing, and then he read it again slowly, with the small interior pause between sentences that he had been using since he was 30 years old. Whenever a piece of paper in his hand contained information, he could not afford to misunderstand. When he finished reading it the second time, he stood very still for a long moment with the letter in his hand, and he looked out through the south wall of the greenhouse, where the long evening light was falling across the cutting garden in the particular way it fell only in the last 10 days of September. The letter said this: "Mr. Whitmore, my name is Patricia Donnelly. I worked as a personal secretary in the executive offices of Whitmore Continental Energy for 19 years. I retired in 2019. I am writing to you because I do not know who else inside the building I can trust with what I am about to tell you, And because the boy who is bringing you this letter is the grandson of a woman I have known since we were both girls in Brooklyn, and I trust her grandson the way I trust her, which is completely. I am dying. The doctors have given me perhaps 4 weeks. I am writing this letter from a hospice in Trenton because there are things I have known for 11 years that I should have brought to you when I first knew them. And I did not, because I was afraid. And because the man who would have been hurt by what I knew is the same man who paid for my mother's nursing home in her last years. And I told myself for a long time that the silence I was keeping was a small repayment of a kindness, and not what it was, which was cowardice. The board meeting that you are scheduled to chair tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock concerning the proposed divestiture of the Marlin Bay holdings is not what it appears to be. There are 3 documents that have not been shown to you. Mr. Vance has them in the locked credenza behind his desk on the 4th floor. The credenza is the one with the brass inlay along the upper drawer. The key is in the small ceramic dish on the bookshelf above his coat rack, behind the photograph of his daughter at her wedding. I am sorry I did not come to you sooner. Please be careful tomorrow. The vote you are about to take will cost you your company if you take it without seeing what is in that credenza. May God forgive me for waiting so long to write this letter. Patricia Donnelly, September the 23rd. Harold lowered the letter slowly. He took the reading glasses off, folded them carefully, and slipped them back into the breast pocket of his cardigan. He stood at the workbench for what felt to him like a long time, but was probably no more than 15 seconds, looking at the small cut stem of dendrobium that lay beside the silver shears. And he thought, in the strange detached way a man's mind sometimes goes when it has just been handed something heavy, that he had been about to walk back to the main house in another 10 minutes to have a small glass of sherry before dinner, and that he was now not going to have the sherry, and that he was probably not going to have the dinner either. Bernard Vance was his chief operating officer. Bernard Vance had been his chief operating officer for 22 years. Bernard Vance was the godfather of Harold's only living grandson. Harold folded the letter once along its original crease. He did not fold it twice. He had learned long ago that documents which might one day be read by other people in other rooms should not be folded more than they had been folded by the person who wrote them, because the small creases a man added in a moment of agitation became, in the wrong courtroom, a kind of evidence about the state of his mind when he had first read the thing. He slid the letter back into its envelope. He set the envelope down on the teak workbench beside the dendrobium stem and the silver shears. Then he turned and looked at the boy. Caleb was still sitting on the small wooden stool beside the side door. His hands were still folded in his lap. He had not moved. His eyes were not on Harold's face. They were on the slate floor about 3 feet in front of his shoes. In the small, careful way a child keeps his eyes lowered when he has just delivered something he understands to be important, and he is now waiting for an adult to tell him what comes next. Caleb, Harold said. The boy looked up. I want you to tell me how this letter came into your hand. I want you to tell me the truth. I am not angry with you. I am not going to be angry with you regardless of what you say. But I need to know exactly how this letter found its way from the woman who wrote it to the place where you and I are standing right now. Can you tell me that? The boy nodded slowly. He took a small breath, the careful preparatory breath of a child who has been rehearsing his answer for some hours and is now relieved that he has finally been asked the question. My great-aunt Patricia, she's my grandma's best friend from when they were little. My grandma calls her Patty. She's been in a hospice in Trenton for about a month now. My mom drives my grandma down to see her every Sunday after church. Last Sunday, when they came back, my grandma was crying in the kitchen, and she gave me an envelope, and she said that Aunt Patty had asked her to make sure it got to a man named Mr. Whitmore, and that I was the only person in the family who could do it because I was the only one who came to the property, and that I had to give it to you with my own hands, sir, and that I couldn't give it to anybody else, not your secretary, not your butler, not anybody. She said Aunt Patty made her swear on a Bible. The boy paused. His hands were no longer folded. They were gripping the edge of the wooden stool on either side of his thighs, the small white-knuckled grip of a child who had been carrying a secret for 5 days and was now, with great relief, putting it down. I had it in my jacket since Monday, sir. I tried to find a way to get to you on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, but I didn't know where you were. Today my mom told me you came down to the Orchid House on Thursdays. I waited until after my homework. I walked down the gravel road. I am sorry if I shouldn't have come this way, sir, but I didn't know any other way. Harold looked at the boy for a long moment. He thought about a great many things in the space of that moment. He thought about Patricia Donnelly, whom he remembered now, a small, quiet woman who had brought him coffee for 19 years and who had once, in the winter of 2009, sent him a Christmas card with a photograph of her mother on the front. He thought about Bernard Vance and the credenza with the brass inlay, which Harold had himself helped pick out from a furniture dealer in Boston in the autumn of 2003. He thought about the meeting at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and about the proposed divestiture of the Marlin Bay holdings, which the board had been studying for nearly 7 months, and which had seemed, until perhaps 90 seconds ago, to be a routine if substantial decision. He thought, finally, about Eleanor. Eleanor had not liked Bernard Vance. She had never said so directly, because she had been raised in a household where direct opinions about the people her husband had chosen to trust were considered a kind of intrusion. But Harold had known her well enough, over the 43 years of their marriage, to read the small particular silence she fell into whenever Bernard's name came up at dinner, and to understand that the silence meant something. He had asked her about it once, perhaps a decade ago, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in the morning room, and she had looked up from the small needlepoint she was working on, and she had said, in the careful voice she used when she was trying to tell him something she did not want to be wrong about, that Bernard was a man who had learned the gestures of friendship without ever quite learning the thing itself. Harold had laughed at the time. He had told her she was being unfair. He had not laughed about it since she died, because he had begun to notice, in the long, quiet years afterward, that Eleanor had been almost always right about the people she had withheld her warmth from, and that her warmth had been, in its way, the most reliable instrument of judgment in their entire household. Harold drew a long, slow breath. He looked at the boy on the stool. "Caleb," he said, "you have done a very important thing tonight. I want you to understand that because I do not think anyone has yet told you exactly how important. The woman who wrote this letter trusted you to bring it to me, and you brought it. That is not a small thing. That is a thing that grown men twice your size and 3 times your age would have failed to do for any number of reasons, and you did it on a Thursday evening when you could have been at home doing your homework. I want to thank you." The boy did not say anything. He looked at his shoes. "I need to ask you to do one more thing for me tonight. I need to ask you to stay in this greenhouse for a little while longer. I am going to walk to the main house and I am going to make 2 telephone calls. When I come back, I am going to bring a man named Mr. Coulter with me. He is my attorney. He is going to want to speak with you briefly. He is going to write down what you have just told me, and he is going to ask you to sign your name at the bottom of the paper when he is finished. Is that all right?" "Yes, sir. I am also going to send your mother a message that you are with me and that you are perfectly safe and that I have asked you to stay a little longer because you are helping me with something. I do not want her to worry. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I will be back within 15 minutes." Harold walked carefully across the slate floor of the greenhouse. He paused at the side door and looked back at the boy once more. Caleb was sitting upright on the stool, his hands folded again in his lap, his eyes lowered to the floor in front of him, in the same small, composed posture he had been holding since he had arrived. There was something in the way the boy sat that reminded Harold, with a sudden clarity that surprised him, of a photograph he had seen once of his own father at the age of 10, standing on the steps of a schoolhouse in upstate New York in 1929, in a wool jacket that had been pressed by a mother who had pressed it carefully, because she had not been able to afford a new one. Harold pushed open the side door. He stepped out into the cool September evening. He walked back up the gravel path toward the main house, and he walked, despite his age and his sciatica and the small constant ache in his left hip, more quickly than he had walked in perhaps a year. The main house was perhaps 400 yards up the gravel path, set into a low rise of lawn that gave it, from this distance, the quiet, imposing weight of a building that had been standing in the same place for 130 years and intended to stand for 130 more. Harold did not enter through the front. He walked around the long curve of the eastern terrace and let himself in through the side door of the conservatory, which connected to a narrow service corridor that ran behind the formal dining room and emerged near the small back staircase that led to his private study on the second floor. He had not used this route in many years. He had walked it tonight because he did not, for reasons he was not yet prepared to examine too closely, wish to be seen entering his own house through the front door by anyone who might happen to be standing in the main foyer, including the night staff, including the 2 security men who manned the gatehouse, and including, in particular, anyone who might later be asked to describe the manner in which Harold Whitmore had returned from the orchid greenhouse on the evening of September the 24th. He climbed the back staircase slowly. His left hip was protesting. He ignored it. He reached the second floor and walked the length of the dim carpeted corridor to the small oak door of his private study, and he let himself in and closed the door behind him and turned the brass key in the lock. The study was the only room in the house that Eleanor had decorated entirely to his own preferences, rather than to her own. It contained a partner's desk that had belonged to his grandfather, 2 leather wing chairs that he had bought at an estate sale in Connecticut in 1981, a small drinks cabinet that he no longer opened in the evenings, and a single bookshelf along the eastern wall that held the books he actually read as opposed to the books that the public rooms of the house were required, by certain unspoken rules of his class, to display. There was no telephone on the desk. The telephone he intended to use was in the bottom drawer of a small mahogany filing cabinet beside the window. He opened the drawer. He removed the small black telephone that had been installed there in 1994 and that connected, by a private line that did not pass through the house's central switchboard, to exactly 3 numbers. He set the telephone on the desk. He sat down in the chair behind the desk. He picked up the receiver. He dialed the first number. The line rang twice. A woman's voice answered, the voice of an elderly woman who had been answering this particular line for 31 years and who answered it now with the same calm, efficient courtesy she had answered it with on every previous occasion. Coulter residence. Margaret, it is Harold. Is he in? He is in his study. One moment. There was a small pause. Harold heard the soft click of a receiver being lifted on the other end, and then the dry, careful voice of Stephen Coulter, his attorney of 34 years. Harold. Stephen, I need you here tonight. I need you to come up the back lane. I need you to park behind the kennels. I do not want you to come through the main gate. I need you to be here within 40 minutes. I need you to bring the recorder, the affidavit forms, the seal, and the small green folder from the bottom of your file cabinet. Do you understand me? There was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds. The pause was the only outward indication that Stephen Coulter had heard anything unusual in Harold's request, because Stephen Coulter had been Harold's attorney long enough to know that requests of this kind were not made except for reasons that justified them, and that the appropriate response was not to ask what those reasons were but to begin doing immediately what had been asked. I will be there in 35 minutes. Thank you. Harold, are you safe? Yes, I believe so. But I also believe that I have been wrong about a great many things, and I am about to find out exactly how wrong. Bring the green folder. I understand. The line went quiet. Harold set the receiver down. He sat for a moment in the leather chair behind the desk, his hands flat on the green blotter, and he allowed himself to feel, for the first time since he had unfolded the letter in the greenhouse, the small cold weight of what was happening to him. Then he picked up the receiver again and dialed the second number. The second number rang 4 times before it was answered. The voice that answered it was the voice of a man named Wendell Pryor, who had been the head of internal security for Whitmore Continental Energy for 19 years, and who lived in a small brick house on the southern edge of the estate that Harold had built for him in 2008, as part of the arrangement under which Wendell had agreed to leave a long career in federal law enforcement in order to come and work for a private family. Mr. Whitmore. Wendell. I need you to do something for me tonight. I need you to do it quietly. I need you to do it without speaking to anyone else on the security staff. Are you in a position to listen carefully right now? Yes, sir. Go ahead. At approximately 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, before any member of the executive floor staff arrives at the building, I need you and one man you trust personally to enter the 4th floor executive suite, specifically Bernard Vance's office. I need you to photograph the contents of the locked credenza behind his desk, the one with the brass inlay along the upper drawer. The key is in a small ceramic dish on the bookshelf above his coat rack, behind a framed photograph of his daughter at her wedding. You are not to remove anything. You are to photograph every document inside that credenza, in the order in which it is stored, and you are to replace everything exactly as you found it. You are then to leave the suite, lock the outer door behind you, and bring the photographs directly to me at the house. Do you have any questions about that instruction? There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Wendell Pryor had spent 26 years in the FBI before he came to work for Harold. He had been given many unusual instructions in his life. He had learned in the long course of his career that the appropriate response to an unusual instruction from a man like Harold Whitmore was not surprise. "No, sir. I will be at the building at 5:45. I will use the rear service entrance. The man I will bring is named David Aguilar. He is my second. He has been with us for 11 years. I trust him with my own house." "Good. One more thing. Between the time you hang up this phone and the time you arrive at the building tomorrow morning, I do not want you to speak to Bernard Vance under any circumstances. If he calls you, you do not answer. If he sends you a message, you do not respond. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "Thank you, Wendell, sir." "Yes. Whatever this is, I have been waiting for it for a long time. I want you to know that. Good night." The line went quiet. Harold set the receiver down a second time. He sat for a long moment in the chair behind the desk, looking at the small black telephone, and he thought about what Wendell had just said to him. He had not entirely understood the words at first. Then, with the slow gathering clarity of a man who had been refusing for some years to notice certain small particular things about the people around him, he understood them perfectly. Wendell had been watching Bernard Vance for some time. Wendell had been watching him without being asked. Wendell had been waiting for a reason to bring what he had been watching to Harold's attention, and that reason had not yet come, and so Wendell had said nothing. But Wendell had been ready, because Wendell, in the long, quiet way that good men of his particular profession knew how to be ready, had understood that the day would arrive. Harold stood. He walked to the small drinks cabinet against the wall. He did not open it. He had not opened it in 11 months. Since the morning his physician had told him that the small irregularities in his heart had become slightly less small, and that the bourbon he had been drinking every evening since 1968 was now, at his age and in his condition, a luxury he would have to give up if he intended to see his great-grandchildren reach their adolescence. He turned away from the cabinet. He walked to the door of the study. He unlocked it. He stepped out into the corridor. He had one more thing to do before Stephen Coulter arrived, and it was the hardest thing he was going to do all evening. He walked down the long corridor to the south wing of the second floor, where Eleanor's morning room had been preserved exactly as she had left it on the morning she had gone into the hospital for what they had been told was a routine procedure, and from which she had not returned. The door to the room was always closed. Harold did not enter it often. He entered it perhaps 3 times a year, on her birthday and on their anniversary and on the anniversary of her death, and he sat in the small upholstered chair beside the window for an hour or so on each of those occasions. And he did not weep, because he had done his weeping in the first year after she had died, but he sat in the chair, and he allowed himself to feel her absence in the room she had occupied more completely than any other room in the house. He was not entering the room tonight to sit in the chair. He was entering it because Eleanor had kept a small writing desk against the eastern wall, and in the bottom drawer of that desk, in a leather portfolio that he had not opened in 19 years, she had kept her own private correspondence with the small number of people she had trusted in her life. He needed to know whether Patricia Donnelly's name was in that portfolio. He opened the door. He closed it behind him. The room smelled faintly of the dried lavender that Marguerite, the housekeeper, replaced in the small porcelain dish on the writing desk every 6 months, the way Eleanor herself had replaced it for 38 years. The lamp beside the chair had not been turned on. The evening light coming through the western window was soft and gray and the color of a particular kind of memory. He walked to the writing desk. He opened the bottom drawer. The leather portfolio was where Eleanor had left it, in the same place she had always kept it, beneath the small bundle of Christmas cards from her sister in Maine, and above the slim folder of letters from her father that she had been unable, in the end, to throw away. Harold lifted the portfolio out carefully. He carried it to the small round table beside the window and set it down and untied the ribbon that held it closed. The portfolio contained perhaps 40 letters, arranged in the careful chronological order that Alina had imposed on every paper she had ever filed in her life. Harold did not read the letters. He had no intention of reading them tonight, and he was not certain he would read them at all, because there were certain corners of his wife's private life that she had not invited him into during her lifetime, and he did not believe his grief gave him a license to enter them now. But he leafed through the bundle quickly, looking at the return addresses on each envelope, the way a man searches a file for a single name. He found it on the 7th letter. The envelope was addressed to Alina in the same convent school handwriting he had read in the greenhouse. The return address in the upper left corner read simply P. Donnelly, with a street address in Trenton, New Jersey. The postmark was June of 2014. Harold stood for a moment with the envelope in his hand. He did not open it. He understood, with the small particular clarity that came to him only on certain evenings in certain rooms, that Alina had known Patricia Donnelly, that Alina had corresponded with her, that Patricia Donnelly was not, as he had assumed in the greenhouse, simply a former secretary writing from a hospice in Trenton to a man she had once brought coffee to for 19 years. Patricia Donnelly was something more. Patricia Donnelly was someone Alina had trusted. He set the envelope back in the portfolio. He retied the ribbon. He returned the portfolio to its drawer. He stood in the morning room for a moment longer, looking at the small upholstered chair beside the window, and he said, in the quiet voice he sometimes used in this room and in no other room in the house, "I am listening now. I am sorry it took me so long." Then he left the room and closed the door behind him. He went back downstairs. He went back to the greenhouse. The boy was still on the stool. Stephen Coulter arrived at the house at 23 minutes past 8. He came up the back lane in a dark sedan with the headlights set to their lowest beam, and he parked behind the kennels exactly as Harold had asked him to. Marguerite let him in through the kitchen door. He carried a small leather satchel that Harold had seen perhaps 5 times in the 34 years of their friendship, and he wore the long gray overcoat he had been wearing to evening meetings since 1989. And he came up the back stairs to the 2nd floor without speaking to anyone he passed in the corridor. Harold met him at the door of the study. The two men did not embrace. They had never embraced. They shook hands once briefly, in the small formal way of men who had stood together at funerals and bedsides, and never required the comfort of physical contact to express what they had come to express. Stephen looked at Harold for a long moment. "Tell me," he said. Harold told him. He told him in 14 minutes, sitting in the leather wing chair beside the empty fireplace, with the small black telephone on the desk and the envelope from the greenhouse on the table between them. He left nothing out. He showed Stephen the letter. He told him about Wendell. He told him about Alina's portfolio and the envelope from Trenton that he had not opened. He told him, finally, about the boy who was still sitting on a stool in the orchid greenhouse at the bottom of the gravel road, waiting to be brought back into the warm light of a room where a man with a notarial seal would write down his account of what he had done that evening and ask him to sign his name at the bottom of the paper. Stephen listened without interrupting. When Harold finished, Stephen sat for a moment in his own chair and looked at the small green folder he had set on the table beside the letter. The green folder had been in the bottom of Stephen's file cabinet for 11 years. Its contents had been added to it slowly, one document at a time, in the long, quiet course of a friendship in which Stephen had occasionally noticed things about certain of Harold's senior executives that Harold himself had not been ready to notice, and which Stephen had filed away rather than raise, because Stephen had been raised to believe that a lawyer who raised concerns before they could be substantiated was a lawyer who lost the confidence of the man who paid him. "Bernard Vance," Stephen said quietly. "Yes, I have been wondering for some time how this conversation would begin. I had not expected it to begin with a child in an orchid greenhouse. I should have. The truth in these matters almost never comes through the door you have been watching." He opened the green folder. He laid 3 documents on the table between them, side by side. He did not explain them. He let Harold look at them. Harold looked. He saw, in the small, careful columns of figures and the dates along the upper margins, the outline of a pattern that Stephen had been quietly tracing for 11 years and had never until tonight been asked to share. He saw amounts. He saw account numbers. He saw, in the third document, a list of 7 names that had been written in Stephen's own neat hand at the bottom of the page, and 3 of those names belonged to members of his own board. Harold closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them. "Bring the boy up to the house," he said. "Use the kitchen door. Marguerite will bring his mother. I want her in the room when you take his statement. I will not have a child sign anything tonight without his mother present. And I want you to be gentle with him, Stephen. He is 9 years old. He has done a brave thing. He should not leave this house tonight feeling as though he was punished for it. I will be gentle with him, Harold." "I am always gentle with the ones who tell the truth." The 2 men stood. Stephen gathered his satchel. Harold walked with him to the door of the study. "Stephen." "Yes. Tomorrow morning's meeting will not happen as scheduled. I will see to that tonight. Go and rest if you can. You will not sleep, but go and try." What happened in the weeks that followed moved with the slow, patient weight that old money and older lawyers bring to matters that have been waiting 11 years to be answered. Bernard Vance was not confronted on the 4th floor of the executive building on the morning of September the 25th. The board meeting at 10 o'clock was postponed by a single, carefully worded message from Stephen Coulter's office, citing a small, unspecified procedural matter, and Bernard accepted the postponement without protest, because Bernard had no reason on that particular morning to suspect that anything had changed. By the end of the first week, every contract Bernard had signed in the previous decade was under quiet review by a forensic accounting firm in Philadelphia that no one inside Whitmore Continental Energy had ever heard of. By the end of the second week, the 3 board members whose names had appeared on Stephen's green folder had received private letters inviting them to resign for reasons of health, and 2 of them had accepted. By the end of the third week, the indictment ran to 190 pages, and Bernard Vance was named as the first of 9 defendants. The Marlin Bay holdings were not divested. They were instead expanded in a quiet acquisition that took place over the following 6 months, and which turned out, when the dust had settled, to have been the most profitable single transaction of Harold Whitmore's 48 years at the head of the company. Patricia Donnelly died on the 14th of October, 3 weeks after she had written the letter. Harold drove down to Trenton himself on the morning of the 12th, in a car driven by Wendell Pryor, and he sat with her for nearly 2 hours in the small clean room at the hospice, holding her hand, and they spoke of Eleanor, whom Patricia had known better than Harold had ever quite understood, and of the small particular kindnesses they had done for each other in the long years when Harold had been too busy to notice. Patricia asked him near the end of the visit whether the boy was all right. Harold told her that the boy was perfectly all right. He told her that the boy was going to be more than all right. He told her, in the small quiet voice he used now in rooms where serious things were being said, that the boy was going to be one of the people in his life that he intended to take seriously for as long as he lived. Patricia closed her eyes. She smiled. She said, "Eleanor was right about you. She told me you would listen when the time came. She told me you only needed someone small enough to be brave." She died 48 hours later. Caleb Briggs was enrolled, with his mother's careful approval, in a small private school in the next county, the tuition of which was paid quietly through a trust that Stephen Coulter established in the spring of the following year. His mother, Yolanda, was offered a position in the main house at a salary that allowed her, within 18 months, to purchase a small home in town and to leave behind the long bus rides that had defined her working life. She accepted the position. She did not accept the home as a gift. She accepted instead a private loan, on terms that were generous but not insulting, and she paid it back, year by year, in the small, careful way of a woman who had been raised to understand that dignity was not a thing other people could give you. Harold lived for 14 more years. He spent many of those years in the orchid greenhouse on Thursday evenings. He hosted Caleb every Sunday afternoon that the boy was in town, and they spoke of orchids and architecture and the long, quiet business of paying attention to what other people did not see. There are stories we tell about the great houses of the world. We say that the men inside them know everything that happens within their walls. It is not true. The truths of those houses are carried in the pockets of children walking up gravel roads on quiet September evenings, in letters written by dying women who waited too long but not, in the end, too long, in the soft voices of 9-year-old boys who refuse to walk past. Pay attention to the small voices. The bravest one in any room is almost never the loudest. If this story moved you, please tap the like button. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded to listen to the small voices in their own life, and subscribe to the channel so the next story finds you. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and remember always, the truest words are sometimes spoken softly, by the smallest person in the room.